Uh, I will not take much time. I will just introduce quickly John, though he does not require any introduction. But still, I would like to talk about him in short. He is very famous in DevOps world as a DevOps visionary, and past almost 40 years contributing in IT industry. Has written 11 books, built 12 startups with 3 successful exits. And I would just like to mention 2 of his very famous books. One is DevOps Handbook. Maybe lots of people have read that book also. And the Beyond Phoenix project along with Gene Kim. Currently, he's working at Red Hat, and in past worked with SJ Technology, Docker, Socketplane, Dell, Chef, and so many things, right? So, John, it's our privilege to have you as a keynote in our Technical Agility Conference 2020. And we would like to welcome you on this. And the stage is yours. So, please.
Great. Well, thank you so much, man. It's fun to be able to do this all the way across the globe, basically. I'm sitting here in Atlanta, Georgia. Good morning, everybody. When the your Technology Foundation asked me to come in and give a presentation, I thought, I've been thinking a lot about, the previous decade of DevOps and the next decade of DevOps. So this is a presentation that was partially developed by Jay Bloom. You'll see, so it's myself, Jay Bloom. So a lot of thought leadership in this presentation came from Jay Bloom, and I'll point that out. The overview of this, I'm calling it rethink, right? Like just be able to say, I'll drive this theme, right? This like, we've done a great job for the last 10 years, right? Like if you think about, and it's a little longer than 10 years, but if you think about from 2010 to 2020, there was, a lot of great momentum. As we say, it's sort of an idiom we say a lot here in the U.S. is the glass is, and we changed commerce. DevOps has been a significant change to not only just technology, but if you think about things like Uber and all these things that have happened, they one could believe that they wouldn't have happened without this underlying cultural technical movement called DevOps. So I wanted to show you how I'm thinking about it. Some of the people I work with, I've got this great opportunity on a new team. I'll show you in a minute. How I'm thinking a lot about like qualitative data analysis. I won't go too much into it. I'm going to be presenting a lot more about this later in the year. Organizational design, and then something we call the 3 economies. So last October, Andrew Clay Schaefer on the left, he's another one of the sort of founders of this DevOps movement. He was early in it at Puppet Labs. We've been working together as friends and collaborators for many years. He approached me and a couple other people to say, would you like to come with me on this journey to Red Hat of something unique we call the Global Transformation Office? And I probably probably the only person on the planet that could have got me to come to Red Hat. I'm so glad I did now, is Andrew. And then right next to him, Andrew's on the left there, is somebody named Kevin Bear. If you don't know him, he is one of the primary co-authors of the Phoenix Project. That's me on the left, the short guy. And then Jay Bloom is our resident scientist. He's got a PhD in transition design from the School of Design at Carnegie Mellon, right? And so like I said earlier, a lot of the ideas that I'll be talking about later in this chapter, Jay has helped me understand those in a much more detailed way. I kind of joke he's turning me into a scientist. And as Andrew says, we wrote some books, right? I was co-author of DevOps Handbook, the Phoenix Project. Beyond the Phoenix Project. Kevin wrote the Phoenix Project. Andrew has written chapters in both the site reliability and web operations books. So if we look at the last 10 years, this is a character that gets used quite a bit. It usually started out with DevOps as the unicorn and security, and it was mostly attributed to Pete Cheslock, but it actually was Patrick Gabar, the founder of DevOps, as a picture. And I've used this over the years to say that, it's sort of the last 10 years was a journey about trying to explain to enterprises that they could do these things that were coming out of places like Google and Twitter and Facebook, right? These things that typically enterprises didn't do. And I think, like I said, we've done a great job, right? Like now in modern banks and large insurance and healthcare, they are doing DevOps, and they are doing things that 10 years ago were unheard of to do in the enterprise, a large insurance company, healthcare, financial. And so, like, again, glass half full, we've done a great job. We've really changed that sort of notion of unicorns and people having to sort of clean up after unicorns. Like, the enterprise is, for the most part, on board, not completely. But here's the thing, right? So as we think about what is happening in DevOps, right? In my experience, it's in pockets of different parts of an organization. Very rarely will I walk into a very large, I mean, like, I'm talking global 1,000 company, where they like DevOps is systemic and it is completely scaled across the whole organization. I've never seen that happen. So one of the challenges is really scale. I mean, you can go into some of these companies that you'll see that have done incredible work with. So I'm a co-chair and I'm on the selection committee for the DevOps Enterprise Summit, right? And like almost all those sessions are large enterprises doing DevOps. And so companies like Nike and Disney and, you know, Barclays and I know these people, I visited them, and what they show you is tremendous opportunities of what they've done. When you actually go and talk to them in detail, they have the same problem that everybody does. How do you scale this, you know, so globally across a large corporation? So this is a report about 70% of all, transformations have failed, right? And I think that's a little generous. So when we talk about, I think the difference is, I just want to say this too, right? I think a lot of us struggle with, okay, we've had this DevOps thing, and then over the last couple of years, we're having this notion happening in the enterprise, which is we're doing digital transformation. I'm like, okay, what was DevOps, right? Well, I think what we need to think about is, you know, maybe who cares about what we call it? And maybe the next decade is going to be a higher focus on digital transformation. And I think it has some context, wider context in how we help the business. But we still do the same things. It's DevOps or DevSecOps. So the next 10 years, right, might be about making sure that maybe the accomplishment, you know, like the accomplishment over the past 10 years has been DevOps being a unicorn and getting the enterprise to sort of not be a unicorn problem, right? A unicorn and a non-unicorn. And I think maybe the challenge here is this next decade is digital transformation, right? And so one of the things we think about as GTO, this Global Transformation Office, which is the four of us, is where have we failed? Like, and if you think about these 5 areas, and I'll be talking about these like 5 elements of how you need to think of things. You know, typically leadership prevents change. So even though in our success of DevOps in 2020, we still have a lot of issues with the global leadership. Maybe it's, you know, it's a bank and we're still, you know, we've done a lot of exciting things, but we're still very reasonably conservative about other things, right? You know, a good friend of mine, friends of mine, or a friend of mine that works in a bank will tell me, you know, when you get hired at an executive level in a bank, you know, you were explained all the ways that you could get fired, or all the ways that you would possibly go to jail, right? That's, you know, it puts a whole different framing on risk. You know, on product, you know, are we building things that matter, right? Like, you know, sometimes we get lost in the organizational design of the, you know, we have product managers, product owners, technical product owners, and they're all sort of serving different incentives. Some are driving BAU, some are driving leadership, right? So are we really actually building, you know, the next hot project that pops up and says, we have to have this done by March, right? Like, is that something that really matters, or is it a pet peeve, or is it a knee jerk? Building the wrong things. Is development actually, you know, do we have synergy between product leadership and development? Like, you know, are we building something that we think we're building because the product, you get it, right? And then architecture, building things wrong, right? Like you know, so we're still struggling between, you know, 1990s notion of enterprise architects to 2000s, and, you know, and now clearly in the modernization age of cloud native. And then, of course, operations is incidents and outages. So this is my sort of proposal for a rethink. So the first thing I'm going to go through really quick, it's something I've been doing for about 3 or 4 years now. And now at Red Hat, you know, working with Jay Bloom, and, you know, who is a PhD, it's helped me really understand how I can turn sort of what I've been doing loosely, but I wouldn't have been brave enough to call it qualitative data analysis, but it really was. But now I actually have some methodology, methodology. So what I've been doing over the years, probably 5 years now, but is I've been doing this thing where I go in and work with a CIO. And basically, they ask me all sorts of questions. And typically, what happens is somebody in the organization tells their CEO, "Oh, you must listen to John Willis. He's done this, he's done this." It's usually somebody who has seen my presentations or knows me, and and believes that what I'm saying makes sense. Like, hopefully, at this point, most of you who are listening feel that way. And then they'll convince the CIO to have a conversation with me. And the CIO will explain all the problems that they have, and I'll say, "Well, here's the way I approach it." And the way I approach it is typically, I said, let me interview, your people, the people who do the work. I don't want to do methodologies. I don't want to do lean value stream mapping. I mean, those are great tools later on, but I just want to have, in-depth conversations with people who do the work. And I've done, prior to Red Hat, I've done engagements for, 2 or 3 of the top 15 banks. One was actually the second largest bank in the world, and where I interviewed 400 people over a 4-week period. Right. And so I'm just gathering this information. And, the thing that I've learned is that, when I started this sort of practice, I was at Docker. I sold a company Docker. And when I left Docker, I realized I had been attached to vendors for like 10 or 12 years. Chef. I was actually a stint at Dell. And I sold the company to Dell, Chef, and then Docker. And I realized this is the first time when I left Docker, I'm going to be independent. I don't not be working under the umbrella of a vendor. And I thought I was going to use all these tools, and I realized I didn't want any of those tools. I just wanted to have conversations. And what I realized is sometimes when you go in to an organization with things like, and if you know anything about me, I'm a crazy student of Lean and Deming. Excuse me. But the point is, I think these things can get in the way of learning, right? They're fantastic ways to construct and organize and help an organization transform after you've done what I call this sort of qualitative data analysis. So my point is, sometimes Lean, Agile, Safe, and even DevOps and even SRE, you get you around sort of bad behaviors or culture, right? Like sometimes you walk in with, tools from Lean or Safe, you don't get this level of truth. So what I do then is I just do, like I said, hundreds of interviews, group interviews, one-on-one interviews, and I used to do this really all paper-based. Now I've actually got a little more sophisticated. I actually take the transcripts from the meetings, my notes. I electronically load those into what's called a computer-assisted qualitative analysis tool. It's an incredible tool. This one happens to be called Max QDA, but there's a few of them out there. And then I can actually do a real qualitative data analysis through the process. And again, I'll have more presentations on this, but going in, they call it coding. You start coding. You can notice that you can. This one is just an example. I couldn't use the real clients, but you start creating these things, and you can actually start. There's something I'm using called grounded theory. But anyway, like I said, I'll be presenting more on this. But the other notion that I've had over the years is when I started doing this a few years back after I left Docker, I realized there were patterns. And, and 7 is always a great number. It could have been 6. It could have been 8. 7. I wound up calling it the 7 deadly sins of DevOps. I've given presentations on this where I can find most work falls into these 7 categories. And probably the worst of all is kind of a funnel, which is a lot of these sort of symptoms of bad habits, bad processes that are not sort of aligned. All fall into what I call security and compliance theater, right? Which means that, when it's all said and done, your audits are theater. They're not reality based, and that's a tough conversation to have with a CIO. And there you go. And so just a couple of things about qualitative data analysis tools. This is sort of the recent day 7 mapping. So I wind up taking all the coded things and I can start like grouping them into different categories. The point not so much is the categories. The point is it gives me the chance to start inductive reasoning around around what I've been told. And I think that, I'm using an example. This is much more powerful than qualitative or survey based. I mean, those things are great opportunities to learn certain things, but they don't give you the inductive reason. They don't give you the ability to really understand context. Like when somebody is talking about using the word risk in a qualitative sense, I get to understand not only an individual within a group or a team setting, I get to I aggregate that using qualitative data analysis tools. So one of the things I want to talk about is the way I think about how do you get truth from an organization, right? I told you I'll do interview styles. In fact, usually I'll tell the CIO to send out a letter saying, don't bring your laptops, come in there, please, focus on this exercise with this John Willis gentleman. And a lot of this comes back from something I love, a story in World War II. In the U.S., there was a team of mathematicians and scientists trying to, in the U.S., trying to figure out weight distribution and how to repair fighter planes when they came back, this idea of bullet holes. And there was this gentleman, Abraham Wald, as they were doing all this stuff, the planes would come back, they'd have to figure out, okay, what's the right weight ratio and to put, new protective, metals on the places where the bullet holes. And Abraham Wald had this sort of aha moment where he said, well, wait a minute, we're making a mistake here. What we're doing is we're focusing on the places where the bullet holes are. Those are the planes that are coming back. What we really need to do is focus where the bullet holes aren't, because those are the planes that aren't coming back. And it changed everything. And some people consider that sort of the genesis of this notion of survival bias. And one other piece that those you hopefully know about the Phoenix Project, written by Gene Kim, Kevin Baer, and George Stafford. It was actually a purposeful rewrite of a book that was written in the 80s by a man named Elliot Goldratt called The Goal, right? And then the Phoenix Project was a modern day version of The Goal. And Elliot Goldratt, Gene, myself, Kevin, we're like huge fans of Goldratt. I've read almost everything he's written. But about 20 years after Goldratt wrote The Goal, he did this audio only project called Beyond the Goal. In fact, Beyond the Phoenix Project was motivated by the same concept that the audio-only project me and Gene did. But one of the cool things in that audio project is, and that it is a great read. I mean, listen, it's not a read. Goldratt talks about how different types of people think about complexity. And what he says is that typically, if you ask a group of people which system is more complex, he would say most social scientists or people who don't understand sort of complex systems, and he uses the group of people called physicists. He says that physicists will tell you that system A is more complex than system B, where most humans would say system B. And the reason is because system A has more degrees of freedom. System B is basically telling you, it's sort of telling you some type of story, right? It's giving you directionality. It's telling you some context. And maybe like you don't really want to know that, right? So I use this example, the Find Dog example, where if I go into an organization, I can't just ask like, how good is your CMDB, or how do you do how do you resolve vulnerabilities, right? More often than not, if they don't know me, and normally I have this advantage because they do know me and they've promoted me. Like, this is the guy that wrote the handbook. But the point is, most people tend not to be open about their problems, and they're going to typically sort of tell you the better version of it, or no, John. And so I always say that, what I need to do is move from like everything's fine you're telling me stuff about how it works good, the system B answer, to get to a system A diagnostics or understanding where I need to find out how. And and again, I've got longer presentations on how you have to. I mean, quite frankly, in most groups, again, all I have to do is say, what are the things in this organization that are not working, that should be working, and then all I need to do is listen for the next 2 hours. But in some organizations, I'll have people who have their arms crossed and they're defensive. They don't know me and they think I'm in there to try to get them fired. In which case, I have to be very creative about how I ask questions. Like, Samuel, I don't ask how active your configuration management database is. I ask you at some point during some outage, how did you find the list of all the services or service owners or servers that were impacted? And then they'll tell me something like they have a spreadsheet or they dumped something out of F5, and I'll say, well, why do you use the CMDB? And they'll say, oh, because it's, it doesn't work. It's inaccurate. And then so you can take this, this system B, system I stuff. Like if you, I won't go through this. I'll go through this pretty reasonably quick. But if you look at sort of the Netflix example, Equifax, one of the largest, still today, I think one of the largest financial impact breaches is it was in a library called Struts 2, Jakarta. And basically, if it was an authorized system, you could see this. All you had to do is basically put in this control command, and you basically could start a kill chain. The answer that was published was CIO blamed the breach on somebody who failed to deploy. But the real answer was, if you get to read, there's a great overview. It's like a postmortem by the U.S. government, where it was so many factors. That it wasn't just somebody didn't breach. It was the CISO reported to the chief legal officer. There was the IDS perimeter-based tools had expired search for 18 months, right? So again, those are the answers that you really want to find. Hopefully you find them. I always said I wish I could have been in Equifax before the breach. I'm not saying I could have stopped it, but those are the type of answers that I look for. And so another part of this then is, I talked about using qualitative data analysis, is looking at sort of organizational design. If we take a look at sort of the quick history evolution, right? We've moved from agricultural economies to industrial economies, right? Sort of the Toyota, the lean, and we're in the knowledge economy. But a lot of times what we're struggling with is, even though we look at things like lean, where did lean come from? It came from Toyota Production Systems, right? So we still have a little arbitration between the difference between industrial economies and knowledge economies, right? Most of the things that we've mapped pretty well in software supply chain, that stuff, we've done pretty good mapping of industrial economy to knowledge economy, but we still debate, like, do all the things from an industrial economy absolutely map, or is a knowledge economy more of sort of a black art or something like that, right? And and I'm more of the belief that you can isomorphically map almost everything, but I think we're still in that sort of figuring out what's the difference between industrial economies and knowledge economy. And so I said earlier about GTO has thought about, how do we look at, when we go in an organization, we have this notion of what we call the 5 elements. And what's here is, if you think about pre-DevOps, right, there was sort of a myopic understanding or trying to learn, like the Agile Manifesto. It was about, how do you get product? How do you get, all these things about efficiencies there. And then the DevOps conversation was really applying some sort of balance, or you could say balance theory, between operations and DevOps, right? So that so if the upper left and upper right quadrant, you're really arbitrating or dealing with sort of a balance theory between differentiation and scale, or or novel ideas, or speed and resilience. But what we haven't done a good job, even in 2020, is have we looked at a holistic balance between what we would call 5 elements: leadership, product, architecture, dev, and ops. Because then you add an extra axis, which is the sort of engineering and design scale with differentiation and scale, right? And so we look at this as, maybe this is one of our failures in 2020, or in this case, the glass half full, which is, although we've done a great job between balancing the sort of needs in IT, if you will, between operation and DevOps, in a lot of cases, enterprise architects are still sitting in 1990s models. They're not up to date with modernization or cloud native, and then you have, in many cases, like I said earlier, product ownership, product management. So and then obviously getting leadership. So the idea, almost like sort of some holistic medicine ideas, right? Like if we don't have balance between all 5 of these, indeed we don't have balance, and indeed we can't scale. So I'm going to go a little fast through this. There's a notion in Toyota that I've always loved. They call the 4 Vls of Learning. I'm just going to focus on variety and variability. And so go here. And I just want to say, so if you take our 5 elements that I described, which is developers, product, leadership, operations, architecture, and you try to map that to the great book, Toyota Supply Chain, and it explains how Toyota did supply chain. They called it the 4VL. You look at variety, variability, and then you map it. You sort of create a matrix mapping and say, well, developers want increased variety. They want increased variability, but they want increased all the way down to visibility, because visibility is like NFRs. Product pretty much aligned. I know I'm going through this a little fast. Leadership wants to increase everything, but operations different. Operation architecture have a different mindset than develop, or different incentives. They actually want to, in general, decrease variety, variability, and velocity, but they want increased visibility, right? They want more, technical debt. They want more non-functional requirements. They want more operationalization. And so if we look at variety, and I'll just go through this, this is, this is the part where if you're already like, he's a little too deep for me, then you might want to turn your TV off right now, because, this is where I'm going to get very into some really interesting sort of science related to this idea of balance, organizational design. And there's some people that, if you're interested in this, I'll leave these as placeholders. I'll start with Alicia Guerrero, basically, who is a systems thinker, does critical systems, complex systems. And she says, by curtailing the potential variation in component behavior, context-dependent constraints paradoxically also create new freedoms. In other words, constraints. So we always think like enabling people to do whatever they want is the way, and so sometimes it's a sort of tenet of DevOps. But there's this point of, when balance, that you have to actually create some constraints, right? So in other words, certain types of governance of a system enables more freedoms. It's sort of a paradox. And then there's, you've probably heard of the tragedy of the commons, Garrett Hardin, like self-interest behaviors contrary to the common good of all users by depleting or spoiling the shared use through their collective experience. What we're saying here is tragedy of commons is, consumables must be managed to preserve the system, right? The idea that if you have a pasture, too many cows consume all the grass, the fields in the field, and then you actually don't have a pasture, right? So there's that, again, balance theory. And then, and again, I apologize for going faster, but I wanted to keep this on time as a presentation. I've got longer versions of almost every one of these things. If you just follow my Botchkaloop, which is basically my Gmail, botchkaloop@gmail.com, and Botchkaloop is my Twitter. It's my GitHub repository. So Ashby's law is interesting. If a system is to be stable, the number of states of its control mechanism must be greater or equal in the number of states in the system beyond. Again, we're looking for great theory over the years that can help us understand organizational design through the balance and looking at more than just Dev and Ops, the 5 elements. And so what this basically says is stable system controls must be greater than equal than the control systems. So think about, and here we have American football, but just football in general, like, there has to be if the offense of one team has so many more tools or tricks than the defense, right? Then there's this imbalance. Whereas, as you take the greatest teams in American football, and I apologize, I don't really know who the greater team, or cricket, right? By the way, I don't understand cricket. Someday somebody's going to actually sit down and explain to me how this game works, but I digress. But there's a balance, because if one team has all the greatest players and all the greatest techniques and nobody else in the league has the balance, right, then we don't have the we fall prey to this notion of Ashby's law. And then finally, another great thinker in our sort of time who is IT is Don Reinerstein. And, he talks about cost delay and basically says the problem with any prioritization design is it is a decision to service one job or delay another, right? We really have to think about, the bottom line is, I think somebody said the other day is, I was interviewing some large company about prioritization, demand, and capacity, which most companies have. Like, there's always this more demand and capacity. And one of these leaders I interviewed, he said this, kind of profound thing is, well, let's make clear about over demand versus capacity, because there's one thing worse than that, which is no demand, which means there's no work, which means there's no jobs, right? So I think that's a point. So to Don's point is, there always is going to be work. And the real question is, how do you use decision-making to decide what should be first, what should be second. And he would basically argue a whole bunch of really deeper techniques and tools. Got a very dense book he's written. Basically, I don't remember the full title, but basically it's Flow. He gives you a lot of science on how to figure that out. So in other words, focus on high value probability items in your backlog, right? Understand the things that actually are going to be greatest value versus the things that don't. And so in summary on variety, we talk about constraints, consumables, stability, and cost, right? That's what we're dealing with when we talk about variety, when we talk about organizational design as related to 5 elements. Quickly, variation is another really important thing. There is a great quote, I think it's unknown quote. It's saying, misunderstanding variation is the root of all cause knee-jerk reactions and over-control, micromanagement, and tampering, right? And so my hero, Deming, would say the importance of operational definitions in collecting data. Without them, the data is suspect. Change the definition and the data changes. And when you don't have a written definition, the different opinions of those collecting data results in muddled data, right? Like, in other words, data for data's sake is dangerous. I would say we in DevOps, we quote Deming quite a bit, but we really don't listen to him. It's funny how, he's the most quoted person in most DevOps presentations, but very rarely do people actually listen to some of his, some of the stuff around his, special cause, common cause variations, statistical process control. Again, I'm going to I think that you should understand something about Taguchi loss function. He's another person out at Toyota. It sort of fits closely with Don Ramstein's. Cost is more important than quality, but quality is the best way to reduce costs, right? And, and what he would say is find the edges of your variability. It's not how tight you create the tolerance level. It's how far you can stretch them. Again, I could do a whole hour on that topic of variation, talking about Deming, Stewart, if you understand what that stuff is. But Taguchi sort of nails it here with this. It's not about like when you're cutting wood, right? You want to basically create sort of where the line is, so you're so exact, so it fits, or molding or something like that, right? But the truth of the matter is, in sort of economic or cost opportunities, it's actually finding the most amount of variance that gives you the opportunity. And we have this notion of what we call the Red Queen effect. And all that means is, it comes from Alice in Wonderland, is, running in the same place is losing, right? And just to summarize variability, variation, statistical process control, understanding tolerance, that's Taguchi, hidden value, and the Red Queen effect. So in summary of organizational design, right there, this is all based on the people I talked to, like these are scientists, engineers, mentors. It's not sort of, finger in the wind organizational design, which we tend to do a lot of, or it's not some sort of social science management idea of how you make things better. And these are people who lived and died on, math, pure engineering statistics, not knee jerk. It's about probabilities and using maths, and and so finally, I want to drive this last concept that is really important to us at GTO. We talked about the sort of next 10 years. I talked about how you can understand organizations doing qualitative data analysis. I talked about how the 5 elements can map through some of the math and science from different thinkers like Harding or Reinstein or Deming or Taguchi. And the last thing I want to talk about, the importance of design of platforms, because we really think that platforms, all right, honestly, we work for Red Hat. We have a platform solution. It's called OpenShift, which is, what I believe, honestly, is the better way to drive enterprise Kubernetes. But we have some theory of why, in general, you want a platform, regardless of whether we think that OpenShift is the best. That's really the only time I'm going to promote product in this presentation. And so Jay Bloom has come up with this really fantastic idea of the way we've thought about the sort of how we do things, that balancing act between dev and ops, has really been sort of a bimodal understanding of we have to deal with differentiation and we have to do it scale. And in DevOps, the conversation has been somehow how we've done a really good job of mitigating that middle area. But we've really just ignored that there is a middle area. I mean, actually, in some ways, SRE is an attempt to deal that middle area. But if you understand where SRE came from, you'll realize that, actually, I'm going to skip here. It really came from actually Google solving this problem probably 10, maybe 12 years ago. They didn't put it in Jabe's 3 economy construct, but they realized there was a middle piece that had to actually deal with the negotiation between differentiation and scale. So, for example, just quickly, I mean, you should all know this, but differentiation is sort of speed, novel, niche, experimentation, incubation, and scale is regulate, resilience. So you can say differentiation is dev, scale is ops. And so one of the things I'm a good friend of mine is Mark Burgess, who actually invented the infrastructure as code genre, if you will. He wrote the foreword in the SRE book for Google, and one of the things he told me in the conversation we had is what Google did was make a non-deterministic infrastructure look deterministic to the developers. So what Jabe would say, the answer, the way he described this, is there actually is a third economy in the middle. It would be called a scope economy, right? So instead of looking at sort of a bimodal approach, there's sort of magic in the middle, and we get scale and differentiation work. He would say, well, why don't we focus on an economy that actually is designed to deal with the sort of mismatches between what scale economy and differentiation economy. And so a scope economy then is this balancing or this clutch, if you will, a clutch of a sort of a car, right? Which is, balancing differentiation from scale and resilience. And then, the things you would think about there is maybe risk, resilience, governance, performance. So just think about how you can now start pushing all the differentiation things that say developers would have to worry about. Take that away from developers and sort of focusing that on this scope economy. And then all the things that, so therefore then developers can just develop, right? That's the problem Google solved, right? And that's what Mark was saying in his quote, which was developers at Google basically don't have to know anything about the infrastructure. They don't want to know about the infrastructure. They know that everything they do is basically a set of interface definitions or APIs that are over something. We would call that a scope economy. In fact, we'd further say that's a platform. So the scope economy really is and we would not call it a platform, as a service. We'd call it a platform as an interface. And so, to sort of tie this all together in the fourth section of this presentation is, I think organizations in the next 10 years have to get real serious about how they think about how they do the balancing act of resources, compute, storage, and networking. We would argue that those type of things have to be bounded in a scope economy. The best example of scope economy is a platform, and we would call it a platform as an interface. So what we move away from is these sort of grand product platforms. We have a platform of service. We have a platform of service. To a model that is really moves more into a service experience where what we would call again, I think a lot of times people think of a platform as something that we'll give the developers what they need. It's a differentiated economy. It's a platform as a service. And we would say, well, if you think about a 3 economy construct, the platform is the scope economy. It's more of a service experience, and it's a platform interface. And in the case of an enterprise, it should actually have. So you imagine, doubling down on service mesh, Istio, and Envoy, right? Those are the things that I think start really exploiting a service economy. All right. So anyway, I put some resources in here of things you might want to follow up with, and then I've pulled like some of the stuff, the Abraham Wald story. Actually, Sidney Decker, who's a Safety Anarchist, does a great job. So anyway, and here's some more some papers on Andrew. And we'll make this all available to you, and more resources. And well, thank you so much. I'm Jay Willis at redhat.com, and Yeah, thank you for listening. For me, it's the morning, and I think it's afternoon for you all. So,
Yeah, thanks, John. And
sure.
it was really a nice overall the discussion that you have brought up here. Your each slide was like having a lots of information. It requires lots of time also to digest that. But one thing
That's
which I
right.
would say that there are lots of things which makes us like getting into a different sky, like lots of tools which is there. But when you are talking about all those theories and practices which is grounded us to that actually that foundation things which is very important for anything, like many things which we have highlighted here makes lots of sense, like lots
Yeah,
of time
and
we
the key
talk.
was, yeah, I think the key was to, I know I went very fast. We covered a lot of ground, but I think, you'll get a copy of the presentation. I think these are things that we think from the sort of our GTO team. One of the things we talk about is, Red Hat created this team of people who typically were not Red Hat people because, Jim Whitehurst, who was our CEO at the time that we started this team, he said that, these are the people that have been defining DevOps and writing the books around DevOps. We want to have them at Red Hat helping us take what we've done well. And so these are the things I thought that I think people thinking about next decade should actually investigate. So although it may seem like a lot of information in 40 minutes,
Yeah,
what I'm hoping the takeaway isn't like, oh my goodness, that person gave me way too much information. It should be, oh my goodness, these are great opportunities for me to form my own opinions about this sort of wealth of opportunity that we can rethink.
yeah. And we have 2-3 minutes, John. I would like to see if anybody wants to ask any question, and we can see that if we can get that answer on
Sure.
that. So, guys, here is a chance if you can just type your questions quickly, and we can read it out your question to John to get that answer. Anyone? Okay, yeah, I got one question and I will read it out. In the context of DevOps, still did not get what is middle part between Dev and Ops.
Yeah, so into that, we call that a scope economy, and what that means is that if we think about Dev and Ops, or in that thing that we talked about I talked about three economies. Think about Dev as differentiation and Ops as scale, right? And what we've really done over the last 10 years is really not clearly defined how those two work together.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about the three economy, we call that middle piece a scope economy. And a scope economy, we can create a more detailed conversation about the things this third piece in the middle does to help developers or differentiation economy get the things done very clearly. And then same thing for operations like governance and controls. So if you think about that as an economy, as a discipline, then we would say, okay, well, that really becomes a platform as, we would call it a platform as an interface, but most would call it a platform as a service. So we're just saying that in an economic balance between Dev and Ops, there's sort of a missing definition. We just say, oh, it works because we do this, this, and this, as opposed to it works because we clearly have defined a third pillar as an economy that you need to think more about. And again, there's some links to further detailed discussions on that in the at the end of the presentation references.
Okay. I guess we are almost close to this, and I know that there are lots of questions there from people's side, and we have some more sessions aligned with that. So
Sure.
That's okay. Okay, John. So we will be in touch, nevertheless, and I will just share with you also that questions. Maybe you can have a look on those questions also sometime whenever you
Sure.
have time. But
No
overall,
problem.
it was really a nice session, and it has given us lots of opportunity to learn lots of different aspects, right? And overall, maybe like having lots of food for thought, and we can continue our learning journey from here. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for your
Sounds
time.
good. All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
And participants, we will be just ending this session now. And next session will be in 5 minutes. So you can be on the lounge area and you can discuss with your colleagues and others, and or else you can join that next session there. And there, now after that, there will be 3 different tracks. So please choose your tracks and you can be there. Okay. Thank you. And thanks, John. Thanks for your time.
All right. Thanks a lot. Sure.
Have a nice day.